All righty. Hello,
Okay.
everyone. This is Chicago Networking Squadcast. Thanks for coming back and listening, checking in with us.
Episode 3.
Episode 3. Yes, we made it. We made it this far. Ain't this great? Yeah. So just for introductions, again, my name's Thomas Southall. I'm a UX UI designer. Alex.
I'm Alex Krzyminski. I'm UX strategy, design, writing, all sorts of stuff. So anything UX, experience design, that's me.
All righty. And for our guest today, we have Anthony Cataldo, who is working as an architect. Anthony, say hello to everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for coming
Hey
on.
guys, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really appreciative of it for you to make time to get out of your day, to hang out with us and talk.
It's not like you can go anywhere.
Yeah.
I know. I was gonna say, I mostly just kind of moved from my couch to my desk, so I think making it easy for me.
Yeah. Okay. First off, how did you get into architecture and design?
Yeah, tell us a little bit.
Well, I kind of fell into it a little bit. So when I wanted to be an architect when I was a little kid, kind of, and I just kind of discovered it through like Lego, kind of. But so it was kind of one of those things, sort of when you're a kid, you're like, oh, I want to be an astronaut or a fireman. For me, it was like an architect, but it wasn't necessarily like I didn't really understand what it was. And so as I got older, I had kind of switched to engineering. And up until when I was applying to college, I had thought that's what I was going to do. And then I realized I was bad at math, and that engineering had lots and lots of math, even like civil engineering, which is what I was going to go into.
Yeah.
And so I was like, started to panic a little bit. And I was like, I don't know if I can make it through. And so I went to an architecture camp at Penn State, which is not where I went to college, but that's just where I ended up going to this camp. And it was like only like a week-long thing, but I just kind of rediscovered my love for architecture. And then from there, I kind of switched gears and started applying to architecture schools. Eventually, I got into the University of Miami, and then just kind of followed through from there.
Awesome. That's cool that you brought up that the architecture camp you said Penn State, right?
Penn State, yes.
Could you tell us like anything specific that kind of rekindled that spark for you?
It's just kind of like, so sort of what I liked about architecture. It was somewhat kind of what I liked about engineering, in that like it was the problem solving, but I preferred architecture because it was problem solving through like drawing and design, as opposed to engineering, which is problem solving through, lots of math and, calculations.
All
and
right.
so it was a little bit, it kind of like struck that like creative chord with me. And then it also like, you're creating something too, which is really kind of satisfying to me. And so with that camp it was a relatively short camp. And what we kind of did there is we made a collage, like an art collage. It had nothing to do with architecture. They just like wanted us to come up with kind of a theme, any theme really, and just kind of explore it through collage. And then once we had that, they wanted us to essentially use that to inspire kind of like a massing model. And then after that, then we took our massing model and turned it into like a building or a structure or a park or something, which is kind of interesting because that's sort of like working backwards from how most architecture goes. But it was a really interesting way to kind of rediscover it.
Interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about what's a massing model? I haven't heard that word.
So like a massing model is sort of like, when you're talking about it in like regular architecture terms, it's essentially just when you are building out a building or a couple different, if you're trying to kind of determine the form of a building, you're just drawing or modeling either physically, or usually now it's in like SketchUp or another 3D modeling program. You're just kind of modeling the main forms or masses of the building. So it's mostly just basic shapes and rectangles, and stuff like that, so you can kind of get a feel of the size and scale of your building. And usually you'll create like a site model to put them into, so you can get a feel for how your building feels in that environment. In this case, it was mostly just so you could kind of get a form to work off of from your collage. And so it was in that way, I was like, that's what I kind of meant when I was saying like working backwards, because normally you don't really pull a form from that. Usually you design something first and then kind of abstract a form from that.
All right. Interesting. Very interesting.
I find it funny that you call out Legos. I feel like Legos are the gateway drug to design. Where as soon as you start playing with Legos, it just like ignites that part of the brain. It's just like, I'm gonna build all the things.
Yeah, and it's so fun. I mean, I still love Legos. I don't think I have any here, but I still like I have those, like, they have some of those Lego architecture sets now, which are just geared towards people like me, and they're so expensive, but I buy them anyway because they're so fun.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I'll build a Sears Tower.
Yeah. The cool thing about them is that they're just so versatile of how they can be used, which is, of course, that's an appealing point for Legos. It can appeal for so many people.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The modularity of design is always something that gets me. Like, and Legos is perfect for that because it's like so aggressively simple, but like you can just literally you just create almost anything out of it, and it's just that's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes down to it, it's just a few different shapes, just colored differently or elongated differently, and you can build, anything as simple from like a little tiny house, or now they have like the giant mega like star destroyers or like whole cities, or you see the people who build huge sculptures in like Legoland and all that stuff. And so that's a super fun tool. So I think it's just like you're saying, it's kind of like a gateway. Lots of people see that, and it just opens up so many options with something that's so easy to understand. It's just such a great toy that's really kind of funny.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so just moving on a little bit, I'm really curious to hear about the design process, like step one of building. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it really depends what what the project is. So in the professional world, you're first going to have, like, for most architects, I will say, it does vary a little bit, but for most architects, you're going to be essentially see a project, a client is either going to ask you to bid, or they're going to open it up publicly, and then they'll list their kind of like criteria and stuff, and you will kind of meet with them, see what they need, and bid for it. And they'll usually meet, unless they're searching out you specifically for some reason, they'll usually have the project bid with several different firms, and kind of balance, and each of you will present kind of like an initial design. And so that's kind of how you get your foot in the door, and they'll either select you or they won't. And so what they do is they'll give you the parameters of the project. And so that's going to be the site, how big it is, and then their program, which is sort of like what their needs and like kind of what the spaces need to serve, and generally how big the spaces kind of need to be. And then also their budget, which is the least fun parameter of all that, but super necessary. And so I'm not super involved in like professionally in the start of it, but from my experience in college and just a little bit of design, what you normally start with is, it depends on what the project is, but for most projects, it's going to be, you're going to lay out you're going to determine your program and needs first. And so you look at what they need and the space they need, and then you'll do what's usually called like a program diagram or like a matrix. And essentially it's sort of where you layer out the hierarchy of spaces. And so it's sort of like what needs to be near what can be away from certain things. Does something have to be adjacent to something else? And so that's super important, because, it's for some of them, it's like, oh, I want to have like a gymnasium in the school, for instance. And it's like, but I need to have like the equipment room near it. It needs to be adjacent, and the equipment room needs to have this many things. And then, and that some of that is just from personal organization that you want to do, and some of that is from like client requirements. And then that changes a lot though. And so that's mostly for like, big like projects or like commercial projects. It's much different for like a private, like if someone's a single family home, or, and usually in stuff like museums are different too. And so those ones, usually they'll seek out a specific architect. And then usually then the design process is with a single family home, it's mostly with this person. And so it's less of an important hierarchy of spaces and more kind of a discussion with what the client wants, because obviously they're personal desires are more important than kind of like smart organization in terms of like you're not having lots of people move through there. And then with museums and stuff, those are a lot more free. And then usually those are the type of stuff you see where you have like the so-called like starchitects, and those are the ones when they usually approach specific architects to design kind of whatever they want. And so you'll see when you see like really well-known architects like Frank Gehry or something, before anything, they'll come up with a design first, and then they'll kind of make everything work with what they want to do. And so that's a very specific type of architecture.
Like down in a way, right?
Hmm?
Kind of like top down in a way. Well, with that specific
a little bit, yeah. And so it really just kind of determines what the client's goal is. And so usually a client's goal when hiring someone like Frank Gehry is they just want a Frank Gehry building. It's not as really important. Obviously they still want the function, but function in that case is usually secondary, where in most cases it's like, I need this to be kind of an efficient space that I also want to look good. And then so usually from there, then we take the programming diagram, we kind of get a hierarchy of spaces, and then we kind of just build out a massing model and then kind of detail it from there into what we want based on feedback from the client. And not every architect will look at kind of the space around it, but generally it's viewed as a good idea, and kind of the way I was schooled to view as like the context of your site. You want to kind of like, you don't necessarily want to like blend in, but you don't also want to be like totally breaking like the norm. If it's a bunch of like, if you're in like a historic district with a bunch of like brick buildings, you don't want to just like put this giant metal and glass monstrosity in the middle of it. Or I think some people don't think that, but and then usually it depends on like, there are some cities that have like historic districts and stuff that you are limited on like what you can actually do. So there are some laws that come into the design process a little bit, but not usually too much this early on.
Awesome.
So let me ask you a question really quickly. When you're coming, you're dealing with the client and you're dealing with their needs, and you're trying to build up the matrix, or the program as you called it. Like, at what point do you talk to electricians and plumbers and people, and they like talk to you about, like the feasibility of these things? Or do you pretty much like, do they come in way down the line when you've already like pretty much got the thing set?
So it depends on like the specific, usually we won't talk to really anyone until after the project's been awarded to us. So when it's very, very early, it's mostly just our own kind of design. And there's like, we have a basic understanding. We're not like structural engineers, but we all have a basic understanding of the structure needed. And we'll usually talk to some structural engineering clients to help us design it early, so we know that like we aren't working from ground zero. If we put it in, we're not like going to be like, that you can't build this at all. But generally for like, once you get the project, then it depends on how the contract's worked out, but then you kind of bring on what's called like a general contractor and then subcontractors. And so the general contractor will usually be the one in charge of kind of like actually building the project. And then there are several subcontractors or consultants that are brought on either underneath the umbrella of the general contractor or the umbrella of the architect. And then you kind of bring them on as needed throughout the actual production phase. And so usually you won't, with like electronics and stuff, you kind of like design what you want, and then you bring on like mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all that stuff, and they'll kind of they'll tell you what needs to be changed in order to make their system work, and you'll try and have them design their systems to work in what you already designed. And it's kind of like this once you get into that part of it, there's kind of like it's kind of like a give and take of like whether or not what stays, what's not. And then there's also then like a whole phase of like where you're talking with the client and kind of designing throughout, and he'll like either try and remove things or like get a lower cost for things. And so it really kind of like, you start with an initial design and it just kind of like evolves throughout the process as you add more and more people onto it until you finally get to kind of like a set design that you're going to go off of. And that's when you have like you issue for permit, and that's like your contract document. And that's when you have like everything kind of done. Although it's never, the building honestly actually isn't fully designed until it's built. Honestly, there's so many changes that going on up until it's finished. that it like, you know, there's still stuff, you know, where you have to be like, oh no, we had to switch this, and especially, you know, with all like with exterior things being like, oh, we can't get this material anymore, so we have to switch it to this, or oh, you know, we're gonna switch, we want to get a cheaper like glass, so we have to do this, or you know, the fire inspector came in and he's like, oh, you can't have this so close to this, and so there's lots of different things you kind of like got to work around as you are going through, and so once you get to that level in the project, the architect kind of transitions into like more of like a mediator role. And so you're kind of just making sure everything stays within the design intent, but not necessarily that things can't change. And so it kind of evolves while you are kind of guiding it after there.
Great, cool. Anthony, you spoke about the hierarchy. It was a little earlier, but you spoke about the hierarchy of rooms or space.
Yes.
What?
So space is super important in architecture, and it's really important to like in certain instances, and particularly in certain buildings. And a good example is like an elementary school. It's very, very important that certain things are next to each other, and you have to. A big part of designing architecture is understanding how people are going to use the space and how people are going to move through the space and how they're going to congregate in the space. And so you want to make sure when you're designing that you are, you know, you're not going to put, you know, like all of these, you want to like the bathrooms near the cafeteria within reach, but you don't want to necessarily right next to the kitchen. And so it's kind of balancing things that out. And there's also things you kind of understand just, and some of it, you know, just kind of from studying, some of it, you know, from experience. And so depending on how you're building the building also changes in the hierarchy of spaces. So the way you organize space in a skyscraper is going to be a lot different than the way you organize space in like a one-story building that spreads out really far, because you have a whole different area. A big part of architecture, space planning, is circulation. And so that's like your hallways, stairs, elevators, how do people move through the building? And that determines a huge part of the design. And so like, obviously, if you have an elevator, you know, you're going to want to build your circulation kind of centered around that. And so that's where, you know, if you've ever, most people, when you're in a high rise, most buildings have like a centralized core that everything is kind of built around. Whereas then if you're, you know, talking about like apartments or schools and stuff, it's very, you know, kind of the corridor kind of goes wherever it needs to. And then there's different ways you can kind of build off corridors as well. There's single loaded or double loaded, which just refers to if there's spaces on both sides of the corridor or just one side. And then in addition to that, there's all these extra, like on top of everything, there's all the code stuff. So there's, you know, code that determines how long a corridor can be with before like turning or having a dead end and things like that. And so it's when you're organizing the space, you're kind of balancing all these things out with the main desire being, you know, how are people going to use this space? When you come into the building, you know, you're going to come through here, you're going to stop at like the desk, then you're going to like check in and then go like upstairs. So like a lot of my experiences in hospitality or in like hotels. And so generally, and a lot of this is determined by the client as well. What you're going to have is like, you know, you want to put your lobby and then you want to have your court. You like your elevators visible, but not necessarily right there because you don't want people coming in and out right by where the desk is, but you don't want guests confused about where they're supposed to go. I mean, we've all stayed in a hotel where they're kind of like, oh yeah, the elevators are like, you have to go around the corner, turn right, go up like 2 stairs, and then over there, there's an elevator. You take those elevators up and you switch to a different elevator, and then you go up and then you can go to your room.
Sure, yeah.
And that's never satisfying. And so it's kind of just basically seeing which spaces need to be where and what's the most efficient way to organize them together for the typical visitor or resident.
Gotcha. All right, great. Oh, another kind of follow-up question to what you just said about elevators. It just popped in my head. I've been in many buildings throughout the loop in Chicago where some of the elevators don't go all the way up to the top. They're kind of divided into what floors they reach. Is that a matter of just kind of handling congestion in traffic, or does it speak to more of technological like restraints of having an elevator go that high up?
It really depends on the building itself and what, you know, when it was built. Like, you know, a lot of and where the elevator is, honestly. So, if a building's really tapering in, you're going to have to switch. There's only so far up the elevator can go before you're not going to be reaching the floors anymore. And so that's why, like, if you actually, that big, like, pyramidal building in San Francisco, I'm forgetting the name, but it's one of the more famous ones. But there's like a two, like, vertical, like, lines that go all the way up it, and that's the elevator, because the elevator obviously can't angle like that. And so the whole building wants to be angled, but you still have to have the elevator straight up. And so some of it is just, some of it's privacy stuff. So for some clients, they don't want, they want elevators that only go to their floors. Some of it's just, if you I'm not sure how it works. I think it's just a single elevator in the Sears Tower, but I'm not totally sure. But there's like different levels of that. And so if you're, you want to just go to one, and some of it also is congestion too. If you have a huge building with lots of people, you can have lots of elevators that don't necessarily need to go everywhere.
Okay.
And so some of that, it's just it's depending on what the building is and what the program is, kind of.
Great. Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, it sounds like, just from what you've been telling us about kind of dynamics between working with the client, finding out what the needs are. It seems like the needs is one of the first things you, of course, hammer out. It seems like it aligns a lot with user experience, user experiences design, which Alex and I have experience in.
Yeah, I was actually interested in that because I kind of always, and I don't know how much you guys have already talked about it on the show, but I always kind of get confused with user experience and UI design, and if that's the same thing or if there's overlap. So what's kind of would you mind giving me kind of a rundown of what you guys typically kind of do?
Yeah, sure. So I can speak to a little bit of it. It makes sense because obviously some of our audience might have questions like that as well. So from my understanding, UX, user experience design, focuses on the bare bones flow of a website. For example, you hammer out, you decide there's a home page. You have to decide, or you have to find out and make concrete what the tasks are on this certain website that you want users to accomplish. It's all user focused on terms of what they need and what they want to do with this website, and also what you want them to kind of do, what you want them to lead to be completed as well. So for that, we would make things called wireframes, which are black and white, black and white renderings of websites of the websites. So images would be represented as gray boxes with X's. Typically, text would be represented by lines or so, and it would just show to clients hey, we know you want to make this website. This is what we have for these flows. And for user interface, that comes up a little bit later down the line, where it kind of incorporates more from what people know what graphic designers do. So for the visuals and incorporating the logo or any other styles that are just natural, that are kind of baked into the brand. For example, is there anything you want to add into anything I just said, Alex?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the UX side, the way that I always tell people is, because a lot of people get it mixed up as far as UI, UX, and software development. Because when I say I make apps, they're like, oh, you code, and I'm like, no, that's more software engineering. And they're like, oh, you do the way the app looks. I'm like, well, kind of, but that's more user interface. User experience is, if I put the button here versus here, it'll be used more. And being able to understand the biomechanics of somebody's body, meaning that buttons closer to your thumb are going to be easier to use. Behavioral design, color theory, taking all these things into account as you're creating the app to make it as easy to understand. Structuring information is a really big thing in user experience too, because it's for example, if you have a fire escape map and you have all this information and it's not structured correctly, it can be really hard to understand where you're supposed to go. So, you have something like that, you want to make it very clear and very simple. And that's kind of sort of the same thing, where it's like taking all the information that you have and structuring it in such a way that it like unfolds in a way that's useful and pleasing. And yeah, just trying to avoid dark patterns too, of like those things where they try to like trick you into doing something. Some of the companies, which will remain nameless, do that, it's just trying to like just do those little psychological tricks to make you spend more money or make it easier for you to spend money. That's
or like continuing a service or like a subscription. Basically,
Yeah.
So for UX, you don't want, our main goal, or one of the main goals we want to tackle, is to make sure when a user is on any area of your website or mobile app, you don't want them to be confused. You don't want them to be like, oh, I want to do this thing. How do I start? How do I start? Where am I in the process? Did I even complete the process? One example.
Like the elevators.
What's that?
Yeah, like I was gonna say, it's almost like the programming. It's like well, the way I'm understanding it, it's basically just you're kind of in charge of dictating how the user kind of just proceeds through the app and how all the information gets to them, and making sure that it gets there that they can access it in a way that makes sense to them and is kind of intuitive.
Yeah, and doesn't overwhelm them too, because again, if you put it all out at once, it's gonna overload people's ability to understand it. But like being able to have structured progressive disclosure, that's a really big thing in user experience. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of overlaps just in how you experience a building versus how you experience an app. That's one of my favorite things about architecture, because I'm a little bit of an architecture nerd myself. So
cool.
I think a lot of people do end up appreciating architecture. I mean, you kind of have to. It's around everywhere, and that's why I'm super interested to learn about UX, because it's kind of something, I think, just because with a lot of technology and stuff, it's so new. I think it's kind of something that people take for granted. But it's something you don't really notice it until you kind of look back, especially when you look at like older websites and stuff, and you're like, you can tell immediately, even from like websites from like 2012, which doesn't feel that old, and you're like, what's wrong with this website? Or like, God forbid, you go back at the old websites from like the 90s and stuff, and you're like, what's going on here? And so it's these, what I think we have the kind of overlap where it's like we have to design and we want to be kind of like, creative in that, but you also have, the main goal is to think about, how people are using what you're creating, or, what's the best way to use it. And that actually was like a big part of like kind of how I was educated with architecture. But that's kind of like why I really appreciate what you guys are doing. That's cool though. I really would always get that confused. I was like, UI, UX, I feel like they're the same, but they're not. So thank you for clarifying that for me.
Yeah. And that's one thing that I find really interesting too, is because like you're right, like there's the way that design is for experience design is there's sort of, as far as I'm concerned, like 3 levels. In the middle is where a good portion of design happens, and that's pretty invisible. Like you don't notice it. It subscribes to all the conventions that you've been using previously, so you just use it without thinking about it. And it just sort of like, it just happens. Like the design happens and you don't really register it in your mind. And then you've got really good design, which you're just like, wow, this is a pleasure to use. Like certain people, like I think Airbnb, when it first came out, people were just like, whoa, this is amazing. Yeah. And, because they were built by UX designers. So hopefully it should be good.
Yeah.
But like, there's always like something that you use. When I first used a Kindle, I was just like, wow, this is really nice. Like, granted, it was a few generations ago, but, and then of course there's the design that everybody knows, which is just like, why doesn't this work the way I want it to?
So. Yeah, I think a good part about, I think a lot of people, like in the public, kind of conflate the area of visuals and design. And for visuals is more of what the UI do, but for design, it's just simply kind of how the rooms of physical or digital, how they are connected to each other, and if like doorknobs are right on for something like that, it's kind of like the digital version of that as well. Yeah, some people seem to conflate the two, but they are actually very different. And back in the day, like in the 90s or so, our job would be most likely, from what I know at least, would be designated towards the software engineers. So they would be in charge of creating the thing, but also designing it as well. So
Yeah.
as people rely more and more on digital products, on apps and all, it makes more sense and it's more efficient to divide up that workload with someone who kind of more has a specialized approach to that. And that's how UX came around, really.
Yeah, because it
And
was
that makes sense. It's sort of similar, like how you wouldn't want, I mean, during some things, I mean, I guess it depends on the building, but, you know, the difference between like engineers and architects, like you technically could have like a structural engineer build a building, but it's going to be very basic and just get the job done. You know, that's where the architects come in and they think about, you know, we want to make it actually nice to be in the building, you know. You know,
is that what happened with
experience.
brutalism? Is that what brutalism is? Just engineers got a hold of the architecture?
No, so brutalism is a whole specific thing where essentially, you know, architects like to explore kind of like the kind of materials itself and the structure itself and creating these, you know, yeah, I'm not super well versed in brutalism, but essentially my understanding is that it came from wanting to showcase kind of the materiality of the building, and it's sort of a rejection of these like overly designed, you know, like Romanesque and stuff buildings, really like highly ornamented buildings, and they wanted to derive beauty from just the form and the materiality of the building rather than the like detailing. And so in some ways I get that. Brutalism is such a weird thing. And I think also it kind of came around with the fascination of like concrete as like, and we kind of take concrete for granted, but concrete at one time was like a new exciting material. And so that's why you see all these, you know, concrete brutalist buildings that are, you know, and some of them are really cool. Usually they're the ones that are like trying to be the most interesting with their forms. And that's when you see the like really cool concrete shell work and things like that. And other ones are just, you're just kind of like, I don't know about that, but
that is a building.
Yeah.
I went to school in Milwaukee, and at Marquette, a lot of their buildings were drawn from that brutalism era. And there was this one building where I go to Spanish class, and it looked like a bee comb. Literally, it was a box raised up the ground like by 10 feet, and then there were dark glass like oval windows everywhere across the building, and it's very unique. Of course, it left an impression on me.
Yeah,
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They will say, I mean, there is something we said, you usually notice them. Some ways it's not necessarily the best thing. And so I think brutalism is one of those things that it's hard because it's very noticeable. And because you put so little into it, it's so easy to mess up. And then there's just, it's just, you know, in a lot of ways, it just doesn't leave a good impression with a lot of people. I think there is value to it. I mean, I don't know if they technically are brutalist, but the Marina City in Chicago, those like, you know, like the corn cob buildings.
Yeah.
I think those are technically brutalist. I could be getting that wrong. And then the other one is River City, which is, I forget where it is, but it's kind of that like curved one a little bit that has like the oval windows. It's lower to the ground. It's on the river. And so those are like the two examples in Chicago that I can think of. And those are both very like appreciated, but there's lots of them that, you know, and then you also, brutalism, I think it's a lot associated with like Soviet Russia and stuff.
Yeah. I mean,
so just because it's simple and easy. So in some ways it'll be like, oh, I'm going to make a building, but it's, you know, just concrete. So makes it, I don't have to have a lot of extra stuff and we can build it quick.
Yeah. That kind of happens in design. You experience design too. You know, more on the user interface side, but like skeuomorphic designs right now are like super popular. Like monochromatic. You know, everything looks like it's just, you know, got like little blister bubble for the buttons, and you know, like it's one of those things that like you're contractually obligated as a designer to design something skeuomorphically, and then
Alex, could you define for the audience what skeuomorphic is?
Not entirely. It's it's one of those things where it's like, I think it's monochrome, and it's one of those things where it's got a dark shadow going one way and a light shadow going the other way. So it just looks like yeah, like one of those little remotes for the light bulbs. You know, it's got the little the buttons go up and bubble.
Gotcha. Yeah, skeuomorphism. From what I know, is it's relying on like real world things that exist in our reality that don't it's kind of like a one for one brought into the digital products. For example, was it like, as you said, the light bulb or so. Like, of course, we don't need that in a digital space, but people know what the function of that is when you put the light bulb on it. So yeah, that's a little bit.
I might be getting that mixed up with something else. It might be neomorphic. I don't know. I'll look it up.
I'll look it up too. I'll put I'll put a little fact bubble post.
We were both wrong.
I
can't help you guys out with this. This is all Greek.
I probably corroborate myself for what I just said as well. So yeah, exactly. Let me look at.
But yeah, that's the brutalism. There's a whole bunch of different forms from architecture too, and so it really, that's the kind of the interesting thing from architecture is that it's kind of, in some ways, and I think you guys have also kind of touched on it there with UX, where it's kind of an of the times thing as well, where things will change based off of what the prevailing style is, or kind of how people are feeling. And so I don't know if you've noticed now, but a lot of the newer buildings you can see going up are like a lot of these, like they're very minimalistic in terms of like they're usually like squares, or like they'll have like kind of very basic forms, and then they like to have like punch outs. And so there's different, it's not like it's a bunch of simple forms, but they're on like kind of different layers. And so you'll have like very large windows, but they'll like jut out, and then you'll have like a very large brick wall, but it's like pushed back from the windows a little bit, and then the entrance will like jut out itself. And so that's a very like in vogue with architecture now. But you can actually also see, and we kind of touched on this with like the website too, you can kind of track and tell when a building was built in some ways by looking at how it looks. And so like, and once you study enough, you'll be able to look at them and be like, oh, that was probably built in the 60s, or oh, that was probably built in the 70s. Or like if you're like, for walking around Chicago, for example, if you see lots of these like kind of beige, kind of concrete looking buildings, those were all kind of built in the early 2000s. And that was kind of the style that everyone wanted then, with, like square windows spaced out. And now when a lot of cities, it's all like monolithic glass, just all the way up. And like they bring back the floor, and they like, you just have a whole thing.
Yeah.
And so it kind of evolves with society too.
Yeah. That's actually something, my background is in humanities. So it's sort of like looking at the whole tapestry of human culture and how it like interacts, philosophy, architecture, all these different modes of thought and how they're interacting. And I've noticed, from ancient times, there tends to be this like back and forth between simplicity and complexity, where it's like neoclassicism, and then it would go like Rococo design, and then it would like simplify. And do you notice that's still happening now, would you say, or is it sort of like have we been in like a simple age for a really long time?
Yeah, put us on the map, timeline of life in a way.
It's tough now to define. I think for a long time, I mean, it's sort of like, it sounds kind of like childish, but it sort of was like a rebellion against before. And so it'd be like, oh, like, the previous generation was going like this, so we're going to go the opposite way. But for a long time now, it's sort of been like, and now that like there's so much architecture and everyone's connected so much in the world, it's sort of kind of like everyone's sort of just trying to find their own thing a little bit. It's sort of weird. I feel like it's been kind of simple for a long time. I mean, if you look at like buildings from like the like 90s to now, I feel like they're generally more simple. They don't do a lot of like highly detailed stuff. And what's really changed is the materials that you use instead. But also like kind of in some ways, I feel like we've gotten more simple, even though the 90s was pretty simple. We've gotten even more simple, especially in terms of like the forms of a building. And so there, you don't see a lot of curves anymore with lots of stuff. You don't see a lot of like, it's very kind of simple. But there is a lot of, it's kind of interesting. And so much of that is driven, at least with like, you know, a typical architect, so much of that is driven by like client needs and what they want. And that's sort of why like half of our job is kind of like trying to get the client to want what we want.
I understand.
Yeah, I mean, you probably
because
gotta have all types of clients where like some of them are more pliable than others, whereas other people are just like, you know, no, I want this, and you're like, you really don't want that, and you're like, well, but
yeah.
I mean, it's the client
So,
ultimately.
Yeah, it's such a determined thing, and it also really changes based on the industry. And so you'll see a lot more experimentation in like homes. And so if you look, I don't know if you guys have seen that Netflix show, like The World's Most Extraordinary Homes,
Mm-hmm.
or I think that's what it's called. But you'll see a lot more varied stuff in that, and that's kind of like, because then the architect has a little bit more freedom. But with, you know, when you're designing something that like a bunch of people are going to use, you're a lot more restricted. And so, and then also, you know, when you're dealing with developers, they want to have, you know, like return on profit and stuff. And so a lot of their focus is, you know, how can we save money? And that's why a lot of what's been driving architecture, at least I want to say probably since the 80s, is when you see in cities, is what is the cost-effective construction that still looks attractive. And so what's working now is there's been lots of cost-effectiveness developed in like glass and things like that. And so that's why you've started to see lots of these big glass buildings, because in some ways they look pretty without having to do that much. And it obviously looks a lot better than having like a giant concrete wall. But, you know, and so, but there's still some experimentation, I think, also just because of the technology available to us. There's been some kind of starting to experiment with like different forms. So, I'm blanking on the name again, but there's a building in Chicago that in some ways it was determined by where it was placed, but it sort of looks like it comes down to a point, which is very cool. It's mostly glass, but if you come, it looks like a typical building.
Yes,
but if you go to the base of it, yeah, it's not Wolf Point, but it's right at the convergence of the river. And it comes, I know part of it was because they only had a small plot that they could go down deep because the train's below them. And the other part was for, I think there was like sewers. So they had like a really small plot of land. And so it hadn't been developed on for years because it just didn't make sense, because the building you could put there didn't make sense for the size of the lot, for how expensive it was and where it's located. It's like super nice real estate. And so now that technology caught up, they were able to kind of like cut it down to this single point. And then the way they stabilize it is they have like a giant water tank in the top. I think it's 2 water tanks actually. And so it resists the pushing of the building.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the wind will hit it one way, and the water will like kind of hold it in place a little bit. And so the fact that it comes down to such a thin point is less of an issue, because it's resisting the wind loads better. And so that's sort of like, as technology grows, more and stuff is available to us, but it's just kind of, and so much of it is tied to like client. But I think, yeah, a roundabout way to answer your question, I'd say I think we are pretty simple right now, and there's more exploration going on with forms as opposed to like style.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
Great.
I had another question too, because this is something that we don't deal with, creating, apps and platforms for the most part, is because like buildings are physical objects and they're persistent potentially beyond the original owner, how much do you like take into consideration, when you're building something, because obviously you want to build for the client, but like how much do you take into consideration about the fact that like this might be a building that's sold off, 5-10 years down the road? Would you say that incorporates different design constraints, or is it pretty much just like we design it, it is what it is? If we make it good, then it will work for the next person just as good as it works for the first.
Interesting question.
Yeah. So, and it's a tougher answer, but I do have an answer. So it's sort of, we're not necessarily thinking about how like the next owner or something is going to do it. Most of how we address that is based off of, we will look at kind of the context in which it's built. And so we try and build something that fits well into the neighborhood and environment, and something that can kind of like fit the uses of that. And so, and a large part of this has now actually been incorporated into like codes in lots of cities, which is why you'll see a lot more, there's lots more codes that will have like mandatory green space, or they have to be set back so far from the road. And so I think a lot of that comes from just designing, being sensitive in your design into the stuff around you. And so it's not, you don't want to be make it uncomfortable for other buildings, and because then that increases the likelihood of people are going to move away, or, they're not going to live in the spaces next to you. It's not pleasant to live in an apartment if there's like another person's apartment right next to yours, or like glass coming right there. That doesn't feel good. But in terms of necessarily like handing over to another client, we try to have things that are going to that'll last a while. And obviously there's upkeep that needs to be done. They're always going to need to have like people cleaning it, taking care of it, and we can't really change if people are going to actually do that or not. We always will have like requirements or like recommendations on what needs to be done. But once we kind of like, when we do the design, the way it works in architecture is we don't really own or address that building again. We take ownership of the design documents themselves, but the owner owns the building, and so they are in charge of kind of like how it persists past a certain point. I think generally 25 years is seen as like, most 25 to 50 years is kind of like the life cycle of a building. A lot of them last a lot longer, some of them last a lot less. And it really just is so kind of like hard to predict how that's going to go. It's mostly just kind of being sensitive to where you're building, I think, is the best way. And now sustainability is such a big issue that is something that we try and incorporate as much as we can also. And that's tougher because usually that stuff's expensive. And so that's kind of where you have to really kind of like convince the client, like, oh yes, it's more upfront, but in the long run, it'll be cheaper. And so that's kind of where that stuff's addressed. But it's definitely something that kind of is a little bit of a weird nebulous area in architecture.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Because I mean, yeah, like architecture is a slower design than a lot of things, because it takes a lot of time. There's permits, there's everything. And then, also taking into consideration the sustainability aspect, like you have a longer time frame to consider. So, I think that's really interesting. I'm also super interested in sustainability and that whole idea of like, because like this fast design, like everything, because like iterating design and creating things and making things like better and better and better, that's good on one hand, but at the same time, like if you are constantly doing that and just like burning up the, like if the neighborhood completely changes every 10 years, you're going through a ton of resources. And, I think a lot of people, I don't think I'm out of the, box for saying that like good design persists,
Yeah.
Whether it's architecture, whether it's the computer mouse, good design lasts. It gets better, but like, you can still see the bones of that original design down the way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's like, you can usually tell a good design, and you'll feel it. There's the buildings that people will like fight for, and sometimes the buildings that stay just because they're iconic, but they'll be, a good design, in some ways the Sears Tower is a very good design in that it's obviously structurally it's kind of a marvel for the time, was the tallest building in the world. But now it's just like a nice building, and it kind of works. And the same thing with like the skyscraper, as old as the first skyscraper was, I'm forgetting the year it was, but it was like like turn of the century around that time. And it was only like, it's kind of a joke to call it a skyscraper now. I think it was like 20 stories, but obviously that has changed. Some parts of that have changed a lot, because I mean, when you think about when it was built, there wasn't electric lights or anything. And there wasn't a lot of elevators. And so actually, if you'll see this in some of the skyscrapers, if you go along Michigan, the older ones, that area in front of the Art Institute where you have a lot of those old Burnham buildings, and those are really, really cool. And a lot of them will have like an atrium through it. Some of them have filled it in now, but they used to have an atrium that would go all the way through it on a lot of them, because they used to not have electric lights. And so if you were working on a desk in the center of a floor, if the building was big enough, there's no light from any of the windows that's coming there, so it would be pitch black even in the middle of the day. And so you kind of have that. And then once you had the advent of elevators and kind of like that centralized core, that's just kind of revolutionized skyscraper design. And that's why in every large scale skyscraper, it generally is just a single elevator core going all the way up the building. And that's just allows you to have such an efficient design. And so stuff like that like really does persist.
Interesting. Awesome. Hey, I have a question for you in terms of like down the road longevity for styles with architecture. Basically, what do you see? What do you think in 10 years, like the trends of architecture might be? Like, what do you see now that's leaning towards that?
Good
And also,
question.
if you want to talk about like software you use or any other thing like that, I'm curious.
So it's tough because it's so hard to kind of like predict what will actually happen.
Of course.
But I think there is a large trend towards more like sustainability is a big thing. So that I think there's a trend towards having a lot of that in it. It's kind of pulled off a little bit, but there has been a big push for more like amenities in buildings, which you'll see in a lot more, especially in a lot of the ones opening now, a lot more, less space for like the actual like person staying in it, but more like communal space.
Okay.
And especially, I think, I in some ways, I don't think the architecture field has really necessarily figured it out yet. And I don't think just because the developers haven't figured it out yet, as kind of it evolves, and especially with like this new kind of like work from home type thing that's I'm sure we'll see a lot more of, especially after everything that's happening now.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like it'll expand more. And so in some ways, it's kind of like, the biggest thing I've started to see more recently is especially in like office design, and that's something that's interesting to track too, is like, because the typical office is traditionally for a long time, cubicles kind of, it was all open, but like each person is closed off. And then now there was like the whole like open plan kind of revolution where everything's all open. And then that's kind of like, now it's sort of working towards like a hybrid, where you'll have, you want to have like open spaces for like work, but you still need to, there's kind of needs to be an addressing of like, well, sometimes you need to have private spaces or meetings, or, sometimes you want to work in a team, but in private, so it kind of, so the new office designs are kind of like a hybrid of that. And I think the next trend we'll start to see is kind of that bring itself over to like, large scale like living as well. So I think you'll start to see a lot more kind of like adaptable spaces in like homes and stuff, like kind of things meant to be changed, especially if you want to like get use out of like smaller spaces and studios, and especially if we've gone more towards like amenities. I think the next thing will be having like sort of like a bedroom that can function, kind of like more Murphy beds or adaptable stuff like that. I think that'll be more popular. In terms of buildings themselves, it's such a hard thing to predict. I don't know if I have a great answer for that. I think we'll start to see, especially given, I know in New York, I think they've started to say that full glass skyscrapers are no longer allowed just because of the sustainability aspect. I think we'll start to, if I was going to guess, I'd say I think we'll start to see a more, not necessarily detailed, but more like naturalistic kind of approach of things. Like as sustainability becomes a bigger and bigger part of buildings, I think we'll start to see more people trying to incorporate nature into the design itself. I think that's the next big thing. And modularity. Modularity, I think, will be huge coming up, but that's still kind of in the works. You see a lot of people trying to do like, I'm sorry?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to ask, what does modularity mean in terms of architecture for you?
And so modularity, generally what people mean by they say modularity is just like, sort of like highly replicable. And so you'll see a lot of this with like shipping container for a long time. People have been trying to make like shipping container apartments work, which essentially you can like build an apartment in essentially like a frame of a shipping container and just basically insert it into buildings. And so I think that they're trying to make it, in some ways it's much more sustainable to produce it that way. It still kind of hasn't worked itself out. Where you're seeing that succeed a lot more is in kind of like that tiny house movement type thing that's taken off, and that you can have these like pop-up homes take root, and those have started to expand wildly. And they're kind of just at the tipping point now where they haven't taken root, because while they are kind of widely available, they're really expensive. I think once you start to see kind of that price come down, I think you will start to see kind of and as kind of also a rejection of this, for a long time, it's been kind of these spreading and you want to have as much space as possible. I think everything's going to kind of rein in a little bit, being like very efficient spaces, lots of public spaces, and then like kind of like an adaptive use, a lot more adaptive use type stuff, which means kind of converting existing buildings that were meant for something else into a new use. And so you'll see sometimes stuff like that, which is really cool. It's really difficult depending on what you're doing, but you'll see stuff like I saw recently, there was like a church that was converted into an office building, like a single office. And so it's interesting. And so that way, so I think you'll see some more of that, but it's so hard to predict where it's going to go. And, I could be wrong in the public spaces, because now that this whole like coronavirus thing has happened, there might be people be like, I don't want to be near anybody ever again. So people might start to really design differently. So it really, it really could go anywhere.
Yeah. It is fun to think about, but yeah, it's interesting that those would be things, like some things that you say might possibly come down the line. If it does happen, if it does, if it doesn't, we do not know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I'd love to see more sustainable stuff. I think that's the biggest thing that everyone in the industry is really hoping for, because that's one of the most difficult and frustrating parts now. If like of any part of like architecture job is having clients cut things because they're too expensive, and one of the first things that always get cut are any sort of sustainable stuff that gets worked into a project, because it is not necessary, like strictly immediately speaking, it's not necessary for them, and the upfront cost is usually high. And so the hardest part is convincing people, especially developers who are planning on selling off the building quickly, that's basically a non-starter for them, because they're like, I want to build this, have it go up in value and sell. And so I don't care that it's going to be, cheaper in the long term, because I'm not going to own the building in 5 years. And so I won't see any savings from that. So don't have that sustainable solution in there, because it's not going to save me any money. And so that's where it kind of gets, there's a kind of a war between, development and architecture. And there always kind of going to be that friction. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. It just really depends on what the project is and who the client is.
Yeah.
Well, there's some zoning concessions and stuff you get from sustainability, isn't it?
Yes, and so that's the best way that this is going to change, and that's the other thing that'll change a lot of what's coming down the pike is as building codes change, some of this sustainability stuff is required and it'll be built in. And so some of those things that are like really easy that have been worked in is like percent green space has usually generally been increased. The amount of like you're kind of step back from the street a little bit, stuff like that. The amount of covered space you can have across the entire like lot is different. And the problem with some of that is some cities, and I think Chicago is one of them, it might be changing. I don't necessarily know. I haven't been involved too much in this, but I think you can pay to avoid some of that stuff. But that all that's kind of changing. And as new building codes come out, it will start to get more strict. And so it'll be interesting to see what specifically gets worked into it, because that'll also greatly change what's built. It'll be so interesting to see what happens in New York now that, you know, you can't have glass skyscrapers anymore. What are going to be these new, you know, buildings built there? You know, are we going to go back to seeing more what was in the 90s with these like kind of tan concrete, or are they going to do something totally different? I have no idea. And some of it too is what building technologies get developed, you know, because that influences a lot of it. And some of that stuff's really cool. There's some really cool stuff coming out with like glass and, you know, curtain wall systems and things like that. And then long way down the pike, potentially 3D printing, which is like still so far away, but there
I've
are
seen
the
those,
potentials.
yeah, the 3D printed concrete where it just like builds the whole, yeah, that's so crazy. But,
which will be really cool. And then, you know, if we want to get super speculative, you can think about, if we do eventually get to Mars, you know, what's going to be built there? Is it going to, most of that stuff will be so technical, but they're all like fantasy projects, but there have been design competitions for, like, I've seen where it's like a Mars house, like a hut on Mars, which is like really kind of silly because there's so much technical stuff that like we can't even begin to handle, that it's like, I don't know if we really need to focus on that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that too, because I just watched something that was talking about how everybody conceives of domes, like whenever they think about Mars, they always think about domes, but the reality of the situation is, because the atmospheric pressure on Mars is so low, you're actually going to be trying to keep the atmosphere in and not out. And so the dome is actually a really terrible design for that, because the anchoring around the outside is just going to tear out of the ground. So they've talked about how it's going to be like, the way that they're thinking about designing it is just one flat sheet of glass, you know, glass or some, you know, substance, and then like a rhythmic structure of columns to keep that, you know, locked in place. And you know, because the anchoring is going to be much better that way. And yeah, but like, that's super interesting to me too.
Interesting. Yeah, it's so far away. I've also seen stuff with that where it's like, someone was saying that like they'd have to bury the buildings because the radiation would be too intense, that the only way to have like a building actually, and to keep the radiation away, would be to like totally insulate it from the outside. And so there's all this like, it's so conceptual with that. That's why it's like so fun, because it's like there's really no limits to that. And that's so interesting. And that, like, nothing like that has ever been done. So obviously it's like, everyone's like, oh, what will it be? But in some ways I want to be like, oh, well, we still have lots of problems we got to figure out on Earth here first, guys, when it comes to buildings. So let's keep ourselves grounded a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. That's the amazing thing about design, is it's just like, no matter how fantastically you get, it's like you have a series of concrete problems that you need to solve, you know? Like,
exactly.
If you have a problem with dragons, like, you need to make like fire resistant things. You need to make sure that, like, you know, yeah, it's just
there's so much stuff to keep in account that there's some stuff that might be an issue that we don't even know yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Design is such an evolving process. That's why I'm sure that like, I'm sure we have a similar appreciation and like the same things about design, because it's sort of like, the way I view architecture is like creative problem solving, essentially, where every project's fun because you're trying to, you get handed essentially a site, which is a problem with like parameters, and you're like, okay, how do I make this work this way with all this stuff the way I want it to, you know? And so, and then architecture is so crazy because it's so, you know, your buildings, there's so many aspects to it, you know, and we are involved in every aspect of it in some way, from, you know, the materials the building's built out of to like what the doorknobs look like. And so it gets, it advances so much into like, it sounds kind of silly, but they get to a point to be in the design process where I've like forgotten that we've done stuff. And so like, I'm like, we'll go to the site and I'm like, oh, I totally forgot we moved that there. And I was like, oh, it looks good. I'm so glad that work looks good. And that's the cool part. That's the really cool part about architecture. And I've only been able to do that with 2 buildings so far, where I get to go out and see them, you know, kind of as they're rising up. Only one building I've worked on is like complete. And the other one I'm currently working on is still kind of going up. And so it'll be cool to see, you know, what was just empty land, now this like thing that I've like had input in from like the beginning process. And that's like just the most satisfying part of design for me, is kind of just watching that kind of go. And then I can't wait until I can kind of go back to these buildings and see how they've like, people have adapted to them and how they've adapted to the people around and how people are using the spaces, like, because how I'm envisioning it, you know, might not be what actually is accurate. You know, there's a plaza space out in front of one of the buildings we're working on. I'm thinking like, oh, it's going to be a nice place for people to sit, you know, and like, but are they really going to do it? The one place I am pretty confident, there was a project I'm working on that has like a bar that overlooks, like, you can see some mountains and stuff, and it overlooks a huge city. And I was like, this is going to be an awesome bar. And I was like, I want to come here after this is done.
Cool.
But
that's good.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. But
well, I do have one potentially last question, because we are at about an hour. Do you have a favorite building?
Yeah.
I have a few. I do, actually. So it depends kind of whether we're talking classical or more modern. My favorite, probably like all time and like classical building in general, is the Pantheon in Rome. Because
not to be confused with the Parthenon.
Not to be confused with the Parthenon. I haven't been to the Parthenon, but two very different buildings. But it's kind of funny because they're almost opposite in a way. The Parthenon is kind of viewed as this like kind of perfect like mathematical thing. Like, because if you look, I don't know, you've seen those photos, but like if you look at the stairs are kind of curved in a way so that if you look at them from an angle, they like fight the perspective, so they look like they're perfectly straight, even though they're not, because it's working against perspective, because your eye will like obviously distort it. Which is why, you know, also actually a lot of buildings, skyscrapers and stuff, kind of do a similar trick where if you had a skyscraper that actually just went straight up, it would look like it was coming out at you. And so almost all skyscrapers taper in slightly as they go up. And so when you look at them from the ground, they look like a straight line, but they're tapering in to kind of fight that perspective. And the Parthenon uses lots of stuff like that. But the Pantheon is almost the opposite, in that it's kind of this like engineering marvel at the time. Like, you have that big, huge concrete dome, and it was like the Roman version of concrete. And it's this super cool that they were even able to build it, and it's massive. Like I think you can fit like a 10-story building inside that, and it doesn't seem like it'd be that big. But then you also, if you look at it, you can see how many errors were made and how it was changed throughout time and like construction. Like, because if you look at one point, for some reason, the like portico itself was raised. And so you can see, if you look at the side of the building where the old one used to hit, and they kind of like worked around it. And there was bell towers added and moved away. And so I kind of like it because it's kind of this like living building that's evolved with the city of Rome itself. And just also walking into it with this like that coffered dome with the light coming through it. It looks fake. Like it honestly is like one of the coolest things I've seen. The other one, I have two more. Sorry. The other one, was actually one I didn't think I was going to like. Actually, I think we were there together, Thomas, the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my goodness. That was a marvel. That was crazy.
And so that was one, I'd always seen photos of it. And I was like, I don't know, it feels kind of, hilariously gaudy, which is where the term comes from, is the guy who wrote it. And I was like, it looks over the top. But
inside looks a lot cooler than the outside, in my opinion.
It's one of those buildings. It's honestly probably the only building I've ever seen or been in that's unphotographable. Like, you have to be there to like fully appreciate it. Because I had seen the photos and stuff, and even looking back at the photos I took, and some of them were like nice, but like you walk in there, and it's one of the nicest interior spaces I've ever been in my entire life. Like, it's so crazy. It's so high. The light coming through with the stained glass is like, it has such a unique quality to it. It's just kind of indescribable. It's such a great building, and I think it was better for me because I thought I wasn't gonna like it. So I was like, oh, this is bullshit, and I'm gonna walk in, and then I was like, oh my god.
Well, and it was a return to the 100-year design too, because like back in the day, when you built these giant churches, like you couldn't build them in one lifetime. Like it took
Yeah.
several generations of Masons like to build
Crazy.
the one church. And I remember hearing about how that was like part of the architecture challenge for Gaudi, is to create something that would take more than one lifetime to build.
Oh yeah, and it's still going. It's still not done. What's crazy is they haven't even built the tallest tower yet for it. So it's like I think it's only like half as tall as it's going to be, which is
Oh my
crazy.
God.
So it's like they're saying like maybe if we're lucky it'll be done in our lifetime, which would be incredible. I'd love to go back when it's like complete, you know. And then the third one is, oh my God, I'm blanking on it now. What was I gonna say? Oh, okay. It's not necessarily I'm blanking on the name, but it's by Shigeru Ban. He's an architect. He's a Japanese architect. It's a museum. I think it's in Quebec, I want to say, but he uses a lot of wood in like really unique ways, and so he'll like bend it and have these really cool like columns and structures. And this one he has like this really cool wood lattice work, and it's a super nice space. I've never had the pleasure of being able to see it, but it's one of my favorite like buildings that I've never been to. So I think maybe that'll change if I actually get to see it. I'm sorry?
You said Shigeru Ban. I looked up some.
Shigeru Ban.
It looks very interesting. I'd recommend our viewers to look at it.
Yeah, we'll include a link somewhere in here.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, he's my favorite like architect in general, just because I love mostly for the materials he uses. He also does a lot of cool architecture where he uses like paper towel rolls, like cardboard tubes and stuff to build stuff, which is really interesting. And so most of those are like pavilions in small instances, but he'll usually put like little structures in his other buildings as well that have that. So I think in that museum, he has a bench that's like cool, like undulating and curved. It's made out of like paper towel rolls. But so I think he's a really interesting architect, just mostly because of like the materiality and the forms he chooses to pursue with that materiality. But there's so many good architecture out there. So it's honestly like the best thing I can say for like anyone listening is go out, kind of explore, find what you like, because there's so much great kind of hidden gems in so many different cities. And especially like in Chicago, where obviously I like Chicago. But you know, there's so many things here that are like great. And architecture is such a unique thing because it can be, it's not just interior or exterior spaces or the building itself. It's kind of everything, you know, it's parks and all this stuff is kind of all incorporated into that. So there's so many things you can find. Like the Art Institute South Garden is probably my favorite designed space. And I don't know if it necessarily qualifies as architecture, but that's my favorite place in the city. And it's very simple, but it's a really cool place to sit. And so I think that's, as designers, I think that's just one of the things we all end up kind of appreciating is like when you see a good design, you're like, oh my God, this is great.
It just works.
There's a visceral quality to good design that I feel like not a lot of other things, like I think art, like in general, art just has this, like when you see really good art, it like affects you emotionally, and design has that same effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why those two, the Sagrada Familia and the Pantheon, hilariously, both two churches. I'm an atheist, so it's not from a religious aspect, but I had walking in there, I had an emotional reaction to it. Yes. That's why those are my favorite. Like I like, you know, it was with the Pantheon. I walked in, I looked up, and I was like, oh my God! Like, and it's a lot of architecture. It's the act of looking up that you like, but like there's so many different things, and the Pantheon is like there's details everywhere in those buildings that it's like it feels like it would take you a lifetime just to like experience the whole building. So those they're so great. So if you can get to those two buildings, highly recommend it. Obviously, I know those are far away for a lot of people, and don't go now, obviously, but
But I mean,
those are great ones.
Yeah, that's one of my thing. Like one of the things that I found out about studying humanities is, you know, like the old, like the Gothic cathedrals with the flying buttresses and like, you know, just having that like, it was meant to echo the feeling of awe that you get in contemplating God. And it was a way, it was experience design. It was a way to like give churchgoers that feeling of like, you know, awe and reverence. and it was affecting the sound. You had the the stained glass affecting the light, and it was just like had all these things. But that's experience design. That's what it is.
Exactly. And it's so funny with those. We say those with Gothic churches, and Gothic itself is a very like kind of interesting period of time in architecture, because it's like post Roman Empire, but like pre Renaissance. And so it's like or not pre-Renaissance, is it pre-Renaissance? Anyway, it's kind of in between those, but it you had they like kind of were pursuing these goals, but they kind of had lost the ability to like this engineering ability of like the Romans and stuff. And so we studied these, and there's so many Gothic churches. They're like, yeah, they built this, but it collapsed because they basically were just guessing when they built it. And they're like, oh, whatever, maybe this arch will work, maybe it won't. We want to have as high. So it was, I forget what the church is called, but it was like there was this one Gothic church, I think it was in France, and they had the highest arches that had ever been built, and it collapsed like 5 times before. And each time they rebuilt it, they built it bigger, but the same like arch, and then finally it burned down, and they're just like, oh, okay, we're done.
It's like we should take a lesson from this.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I don't know what's better. It's just like that the persistence of human ingenuity, or that's great.
Awesome.
So,
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, I think it's a good time to wrap things up. I don't know if you guys. What you guys are thinking?
Yeah, I honestly thank you guys for having me. I could obviously talk about this stuff for like forever, but I'm sure also we can't talk for like too long.
Yeah, I think we figured out what your podcast is going to be. So
yeah. Awesome.
But anyway, thanks for everybody who stuck around and listened to us here at the Chicago Networking Squadcast. So
and thank you, Anthony, once again, of course, for your time.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
And, we're going to be trying to release the episodes on Tuesday every week. So stay tuned, check our LinkedIns, and, we'll let you know where we're connected in some form of editing, which either Thomas or I will do.
Hello? Right there.
Somewhere. We'll be somewhere. So, but join us next time on Chicago Networking Squadcast.
All righty. Okay.